today's agenda, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to be looking at what is REMI from a broad 30,000 foot view. We're also going to frame the issue of Biden's Buy American policy, and we're going to look at the economic outcomes that can possibly come with this. We're going to look at a live demo of that policy, and leading up to that live demo, we're going to look at the assumptions and the methodology that we took to get to that model. So, looking at who we are, REMI stands for Regional Economic Models Incorporated. We were founded in 1980, and all over our website you'll see that we were founded on the transformative idea that government decision makers should test the economic effects of their policies before they're implemented. We work with local, state, and national agencies all across the country, and we are the nation's leader in the policy modeling sphere. Our team of research economists and software developers are dedicated to continued model innovation, and we pride ourselves that our success is measured by the success of our clients. So continuing on, what is the Buy American Act exactly? It was signed into law on, well, at least the most recent implementation of this law was signed into law on January 25th, 2021 by President Joe Biden. Specifically, it is restrictions on what goods the federal government can purchase. So it is a price preference law, which means it is not an outright prohibition that the government cannot purchase foreign end products, but it does incentivize and encourage the use of domestic goods by imposing certain price preferences on items that are sourced domestically. There are various waivers and exceptions to this law, including public interest. That's probably the most discretionary, and that was given to the president and agency heads, and they're able to waive this requirement if it is not in quote unquote the public interest. Trade agreements are also another big exception. This was implemented in 1979 when we signed the Trade Agreements Act. It established that the presidential authority to waive Buy American requirements due to trade agreements, and this ability was then delegated to U.S. trade representatives that were in charge of procurement. Virtually every trade agreement is an exception to the Buy American rule, including the World Trade Organization Government Procurement Agreement. Unavailability is another big exception. So if products aren't available in the US in sufficient quantities or qualities, that is another reason to be able to waive these requirements. And last but definitely not least is cost. So if a good's cost is at least a specified percentage lower than the cost of the comparable US product, the requirements can be waived. So looking at the next slide, we have the main changes that come with this 2021 executive order. This is a very nice, succinct graph of exactly what changes have been made, but going over it quickly, we have domestic end products that are made wholly or predominantly of steel. The input requirement of domestic materials for it to be considered a domestic end product has been increased from 50% to 95% of the product. With other end products, this jump was not nearly as large. It was increased from 50% to 55%. And then looking at the bottom row, we also have changes in the price preference rules, which means that, so the change is that in large businesses, the price preference was increased from 6% to 20%. So simply speaking, if the foreign good is 20% lower cost than the domestic good, that is a reason to be able to waive these Buy American requirements. The same goes for small businesses, but it was raised from 12% to 30%. So again, just to reiterate, that means that if the foreign end good is 30% cheaper than the domestic end good, the requirement can be waived. So continuing on, we have a short history behind the Buy American Act. This is definitely not the first time that we've seen such regulations implemented. The first one was put in place in 1933, and it was signed into law by Herbert Hoover. This mandates that there is a preference of US-made goods, products, and construction materials for most purchases above a certain price threshold by the federal government. For products in this act to have been domestic end products, they must have been 100% manufactured in the United States with at least 50% US content. And these rules applied to the federal government only, not to third parties. But this was then changed in 1982 with the Buy American Act of 1982. This made the act applicable to third-party agencies using federal funds, and it also really greatly extended the Buy American Act to transportation and infrastructure spending. In 2017 then, President Trump, he signed an executive order to strengthen the acts that were in existence. So this particular executive order rigorously enforced immigration laws, as well as initiated investigations into regulations, policies, and operational changes that may be implemented in order to better protect American economic interests. It did not change any rules, but simply implemented investigations into how we can strengthen them. And the same goes for 2019. He signed 2 more executive orders, one in February and one in July. The February Act encouraged the strengthening of the act in the realm of the infrastructure projects, and the act in July encouraged a study on the policies that would later be put in place by President Joe Biden. And so from this order of events, we get President Biden's 2021 American executive order, Buy American executive order. So then we looked into what possibly might be affected by this policy. As economists, we get curious, and so the implications of this act, as with other protectionist policies, it is hoped that United States manufacturing will see a boost as a result of the preferential treatment and possibly dampen the effects of predatory foreign pricing. But this also has to be weighed in light of the consequences of increased government spending and finding a way to pay for that spending out of budgets or increased taxation. Also, imports are expected to fall to some degree as a direct consequence of the policies. And then we would like to state a caveat that we found out while researching these things that 97% of government purchases by cost are already American made. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go into this live demo. So on that note, I'm going to pass this off to Tobias, who will do our demo for us.
Thank you, Julia. So today we're going to be showing off PI Plus, our flagship model here at REMI, and demonstrating some of the features that it can bring to bear while analyzing this particular problem. So to talk about the model a little bit before we get to the problem at hand. Oops, sorry. So it's a combination of different factors. So a large core of the model is a general equilibrium or a computed general equilibrium model, backed up with a national input-output table and estimated econometric parameters. And there's also an economic geography to dictate how certain regions can interact with each other based on distance, or how close they are as neighbors. And taken together, that makes what for our integrated economic modeling approach. Here is an abstracted view of our model. We're not going to go through all of these, but at a high level, we do divide the components into 5 main blocks that interact with each other. So we have output and demand, labor and capital demand, population and labor supply, compensation and prices, and market shares. And what we're really going to be looking at here is how output and market share can work together to change the rest of the economy. To go through our assumptions, we're using a national PI plus model that divides the country into 8 Bureau of Economic Analysis economic regions and looks at 160 industries following NAICS codes. The crucial number here is the regional purchase coefficient, or how much of a region's consumption is self-supplied for a given industry. Now that means that 1 minus the regional purchase coefficient is how much of a region's consumption by industry is supplied from outside the region. So we have these national purchase coefficients, or these RPCs at a national level. And if we assume that government demand follows those same regional purchase coefficient patterns, we figure out how much government demand of an industry is met from outside the region. So using those numbers, we're going to model 2 scenarios. One is the optimistic pie in the sky scenario, where every dollar of government imports or government procurement shifts from imports to domestic sales. And then we have a more pessimistic, maybe more reasonable scenario where only 50% of the value of government imports shifts to domestic sales. Now, harkening back to the changes that President Joe Biden made, one of the more striking ones was that iron and steel products, or products that are primarily iron and steel, have a 95% made in America requirement. For the purposes of rounding up, then we've assumed that iron and steel still see this 100% shift. And we've also done this as a 10-year forecast. Now there is some whether it should be some argument whether it should be longer or shorter. Looking at this more in the short term, this is only done by executive order, and executive orders are susceptible to being changed or shifted with a new administration. On the other hand, Buy American has a long and storied history in this country, and there is little reason to suspect that any new administration in the years going forward would change this or weaken this in a meaningful way. So 10 years seems like a nice and comfortable range to cover that.